address is the relationship between technology and cities. I want to focus especially on the high-tech factor. I think of cities as complex but incomplete systems. Today, when you think of technology, there are two vectors that I would like to sort of focus on, and I think they really matter. They are drastically different. On the one hand, the relationship between technology and cities is intermediated by the fact of accelerated rates of obsolescence in technologies. If you think historically, cities and technology have had a very good relationship. Think of the Roman aqueducts. Think of the buildings that were built in London in the 1600s. Those buildings incorporated technology in ways that today allow us to keep upgrading the technology and sort of fixing up the building when it's falling apart. Today, I would argue, and it's an argument, that the rate of obsolescence of technologies is so fast, so accelerated, that they become, potentially at least, a risk to cities. Imagine a building chock full with technologies that are going to be become obsolescent very, very fast. Those technologies could literally pull down whole buildings, whole districts, office districts. The buildings can still be used, but they become sort of second-class citizens. So it's a lot of wasted resources, and then you have the challenge of these sort of degraded buildings. That is sort of one very, very dramatic image. So deploying technologies in buildings has to be done intelligently. And I always like to say that a lot of what we call smart cities is not necessarily so smart. There's a second dimension that I would like to address, and that is what interests me probably the most, which is, and returning now again to the space of the city, which is deploying technologies that begin to open source urban space. And I think of the neighborhood as the extreme case, because the neighborhood in a way is that space that is modest, that has not been the site for major innovations, that, you know, is just sitting there. And neighborhood characters, the child, the grandmother, the homeless person, the local crazy, etc., they are sort of characters that don't fit comfortably in the high-tech imagery that we have about cities. But most space of a large city is actually that type of space, not always in this sort of exaggerated image of the neighborhood that I might use. Now the question then is, how can I deploy technologies? And I'm thinking especially about ICTs, and information and communication technologies here. How can I deploy such technologies to actually make the neighborhood to make the whole city actually a more distributed space, a space where every part of it becomes is a component in a tissue that is live with applications of all sorts, good applications. I'm thinking of, in a way, perhaps a bit romantically, the democratizing of these spaces, so that the neighborhood grandmother does not feel she's out of the loop. On the contrary, she's very much in the loop, and she probably has more time to spend in that loop than your average citizen. That is a bit the image. Now, can we open source the neighborhood? And what would that mean? Let me frame it in terms of two issues. One issue is the center of the city and the codified knowledge of the center. The experts, the government, specialized entities, all those consultants, etc., etc. I don't have anything against them, but you know, that is a bit the codified knowledge of the center. So a first point for me is, how do we bring in that neighborhood knowledge into the codified knowledge of the center? And that would really mean partially disassembling the knowledge of the center. and making it part of this distributed space. It would also mean inventing new types of applications that can allow the technologically, how would I say, the technological crowd. But I'm also thinking of a learning curve in the neighborhood, so that different actors in the neighborhood, depending on what they do, depending on what interests them, are actually also part of that making of a new kind of application that enables the neighborhood to be part of a larger city conversation. Now, when I think of the neighborhood, I think of a space that has its own types of knowledge and that has its own needs, its own curiosities and problems that they would like solutions for, imaginaries for which certain technical applications would work very well. So it's sort of a bundle of issues that is also happening in the center. But I argue in the neighborhood, every neighborhood is a bit different. And certainly, collectively, the neighborhoods are a different space from the space of the center. The space of the center is by now a space marked by a corporate character. Even apartment buildings, shopping malls have a kind of built environment that we in the past associated with corporations. High quality, very standardized, often a brilliant architect who makes each building look a bit differently. So the center of the city is marked by a kind of harmonized built environment that may have many different features because of brilliant architects and designs, and I don't mean that ironically now, though it might sound a bit ironically, but I don't mean that ironically. That at the same time smells of a kind of high level of standardization, a high level, and has its own sort of peculiar modes of being used, probably a 24-hour cycle in many of those places. The neighborhood is more local, it's made more by the people, it is less standardized, it has fewer influx, lesser influx of brilliant architects and brilliant designers, etc., etc. So, partly for that reason, my concern is how do we bring that knowledge, those practices, those imaginaries, those desires of the neighborhood into the center. And the easiest vectors I can think of are knowledge, neighborhood knowledge, and the other one, neighborhood information.